At Aeron 50 on May 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton stood in the cramped Combat Information Center of USS England and watched a single thin line of sound crawl across the sonar screen. 6 knots. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, like a heartbeat you can't ignore. Outside the steel hull, the Pacific was black and empty north of Bougainville. No moonlight, no ships visible, no tracer fire, nothing that looked like a battle. But Pendleton's sonar operator didn't have to see the enemy to know it was there. The ping returned, again and again, at a rhythm that said, metal, moving, deep. Pendleton was 37 years old. This was his first war patrol as commanding officer. He had 0 submarine kills, and the entire destroyer Escort was built around one obsession: finding submarines in water that didn't want them found. USS England wasn't a glamorous fleet destroyer. She was shorter, smaller, cheaper, built fast, built in numbers, built to be spent if the math demanded it. Her men knew that. They didn't say it out loud, but they lived with the truth that escort often meant shield, and shields got hit. Still, England carried something unusual. On her forecastle deck sat a weapon most captains didn't love and many didn't trust. 24 forward-throwing spigot mortars arranged in neat rows like a steel garden. The British had named it Hedgehog, and right now it was either going to justify its existence or become another clever idea that looked better on paper than on the ocean. Because depth charges had been killing submarines for decades. Everybody knew how depth charges worked. They were familiar, loud, cathartic. You rolled them off the stern, set the fuse to an estimated depth, and you prayed your estimate wasn't wrong. You heard thunder, you felt the deck plates jump, you told yourself you'd done something. The problem was that submarines didn't care about your feelings. The ocean didn't care about your doctrine. And Pendleton had learned, painfully, quietly, that the traditional method had a built-in flaw no one liked to admit. When you attacked with depth charges, you usually lost sonar contact at the worst possible moment. You'd found the enemy, then you'd blindfolded yourself during the strike. A destroyer escort would charge toward the contact, roar over the suspected position, and then drop charges behind it like a man throwing punches while running past his target. And by the time those charges sank to detonation depth, the submarine had already moved, or changed depth, or turned, or simply vanished into the chaos. Because depth charges did something else that was devastating. They disturbed the water so violently that sonar could become useless for long minutes afterward. You'd create a roaring bubble of noise and turbulence, and the submarine could slip away while you were listening to your own explosions. So the war produced a new idea, a different logic. Instead of throwing explosives behind your ship, you would throw them ahead. You would keep sonar contact throughout the attack. You would put a circular pattern of projectiles in the water in front of you, projectiles that only exploded if they hit something solid. No explosion meant a miss. A silent miss. No water disturbance, no false confidence, just the brutal clarity of mathematics. That weapon was Hedgehog. And at Sarah 150, Pendleton was betting his reputation and his crew's lives on it. Because the contact wasn't random, it wasn't luck, it wasn't a rumor. 4 days earlier, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had decoded a Japanese transmission. A submarine was coming, a specific submarine. I-16, and the intercepted message didn't just say, somewhere out there. It gave timing, it gave route, it gave intention. The intelligence was so clean it felt like cheating, and the Americans were not going to waste it. 2 sister ships formed a search group with England and positioned themselves along the projected path like hunters waiting at a river crossing. But even perfect intelligence didn't win the fight. You still had to hit the target, and submarines had survived for years because hitting them was hard. Pendleton leaned toward the sonar plot as if his posture could sharpen the return. The operator called out bearing and range. The contact held at 6 knots, then dipped. The submarine was diving. Standard Japanese evasion, And Pendleton knew what came next. Radical turns, depth changes, an attempt to make the attack pattern wrong by seconds and yards. In anti-submarine warfare, seconds and yards were everything. A Hedgehog projectile sank at a steady rate. It took time to reach depth. A submarine moving at 6 knots could shift far enough in those seconds to slide out of the pattern. If you guessed where it would be, you missed. If you kept contact and calculated correctly, you killed. Pendleton didn't like guessing. He liked numbers. He liked procedures that could be repeated. He liked weapons that didn't ask him to believe in superstition. And that's why he trusted the weapon no one else believed in, because the math didn't care what you preferred. The first Hedgehog salvo left the ship with a clanging mechanical violence, 24 projectiles arcing forward in a tight spread. They splashed into the Pacific 200 yards ahead, each one sinking quickly in the black water. Everyone in CIC waited for the sound that mattered. A detonation. Nothing. Silence. A miss. On a depth charge attack, a miss could still sound like success. You'd hear explosions and convince yourself you'd hurt the submarine. Hedgehog didn't give you that comfort. It didn't let you lie. It told you the truth. You did not hit. Pendleton ordered another run. The ship turned, engines biting into the water. Sonar reacquired. The contact had turned inside the pattern. Again, the salvo. Again, the splash. This time, one detonation. A hit. The explosion kicked up a pressure wave so hard it lifted England's bow. Men swore and grabbed rails. For a heartbeat, the CIC felt like the ship had been punched from below. But one hit wasn't always enough. A Hedgehog bomb could punch through steel. It could blow open a pressure hull, but submarines were stubborn machines. A single breach might mean flooding. Slow, manageable flooding, if the crew reacted fast. So Pendleton drove them again. Attack, miss, adjust, attack, miss. The fathometer data came in and changed the equation. The submarine had gone deeper than expected. 300 feet. Then more. Pendleton realized the problem. He had been firing solutions as if the submarine would behave like the last one he'd studied on paper, like a training target, like a predictable object. But this wasn't training. This was a Japanese commander who knew he was being hunted. The submarine was turning inside the circle, going deep, trying to make the math fail. Pendleton's answer wasn't anger or bravado. It was recalculation. He corrected the solution and ordered the 5th run, 24 projectiles. A brief pause, then 4 detonations, sharp, clustered, then 6, and then something different, a single, massive underwater blast that sounded less like explosions and more like the ocean itself snapping. The stern lifted out of the water, not metaphorically, physically. The ship's tail rose as if the Pacific had decided to toss a destroyer escort like driftwood. Sailors slammed into bulkheads. Equipment rattled. For a moment, even the men who doubted Hedgehog stopped doubting anything and simply held on. Then the sea settled. 20 minutes later, debris began to surface. Oil, wood, fabric. Small pieces of a machine that had once carried a crew of men who believed the ocean would protect them. I-16 was gone. And it wasn't just one submarine. It was the opening of a door. Because Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had decoded another set of transmissions, another picture, a wider plan. 7 Japanese submarines had been stationed in a scouting line north of the Admiralty Islands, an early warning fence across likely American approach routes toward the Marianas. They were Toyota's eyes, and now those eyes were about to be blinded. On May 20th, Commander Hamilton Haines received the intelligence at Tulagi and understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't a single submarine hunt anymore. It was a rare gift. The enemy had set up a predictable line, and the Americans knew where the line was. The Japanese called it a patrol line designated In-A. The submarines were placed at intervals. trained to spot American carrier task forces moving toward targets like the Marianas or Palau. RO-14, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, RO-116, 7 steel cylinders, 7 crews, a total of hundreds of men whose job was to see the Americans first. Haines had 3 destroyer escorts available, 3 ships, 7 targets. On paper, it looked impossible. On paper, you didn't hunt 7 submarines in open ocean with 3 small escorts. You might chase one, you might scare one off, you might spend days listening to empty water and go home with nothing. But Pendleton had proven something with I-16. Not just that Hedgehog could work, but that his ship could apply it with discipline. 5 attacks, 1 kill, a 20% kill rate, already far beyond what skeptics said was realistic. More importantly, it changed the mood. The weapon stopped being an odd British experiment and became something tangible. The crew had felt the explosions, they'd seen the debris, the ocean had delivered proof. They sailed out of Purvis Bay on May 21st in a classic hunter-killer formation, line abreast at night with wide spacing, radar sweeps constantly, sonar pinging. The Japanese submarines were now under strict radio silence, but silence didn't make them invisible. Batteries still needed charging. Diesel engines still needed air. That routine was the weakness in every submarine ever built. Submarines could hide underwater, yes, but they could not live there forever. And anti-submarine warfare was often a war of patience against necessity. Pendleton studied charts in his cabin and considered the human mind behind the Japanese plan. A patrol line works only if the enemy moves where you think they will. The Japanese were placing their submarines along routes American forces had used before. They were betting that patterns repeated. And they were right. Humans repeat patterns. But now the Americans had a deeper advantage. They didn't have to guess. They had positions. They had timing. The Japanese didn't know their own plan had been compromised. So the hunt became a timing problem. A submarine would surface at night to recharge batteries, making it vulnerable to radar. If you caught it on the surface, you could force it to crash dive. Then sonar would take over. Then Hedgehog would do what depth charges couldn't, strike without blinding the attacker. It was a chain: radar, dive, sonar, Hedgehog. Each link mattered, and in the early hours of May 22nd, that chain snapped tight around the first submarine in the NA line. At 0350, USS George detected a surface contact at long range. The submarine, RO-106, was recharging her batteries. Diesel engines required air, and for a moment, the Japanese commander was exposed to the sky. He never saw the escorts coming. Searchlight beams cut across the darkness. The submarine crash-dived immediately. Seawater flooded ballast tanks. The bow dipped. Within 90 seconds, she was submerged. George fired Hedgehog at 0415, 24 splashes. Silence. Miss. The submarine had turned during the sink time, and this was the razor edge of Hedgehog. It didn't care how brilliant the concept was if your solution was wrong by a few yards. At 0425, England regained sonar contact at 1,400 yards. RO-106 was running deep, making radical turns. The Japanese commander knew the defensive game. Turn inside the pattern, change depth constantly, force the attackers to waste ammunition. Pendleton's answer was not to rush. He made his sonar team track every turn like accountants tracking stolen money. Bearing, range, depth change, speed estimate, and then he fired only when the solution was clean enough to justify the expenditure. The first attack missed. RO-106 had turned just enough in the descent time. Pendleton didn't curse the weapon. He adjusted the lead. Second attack at 0501. 24 projectiles sank into the darkness. 3 detonations. Quick. Then a massive underwater explosion that rolled across the surface like an invisible storm. The hull shuddered. George and Raby felt it thousands of yards away. At sunrise, an oil slick half a mile wide spread across the water. Debris floated. Metal fragments, splinters, scraps of insulation. No survivors. Kill number 2, 24 hours after I-16. The 3 destroyer escorts reformed their line and continued northeast along the NA position map, like men walking a fence line in fog, knowing there were traps ahead. They were no longer searching randomly. They were harvesting. At 0600 on May 23rd, Raby's radar picked up another surface contact at extreme range. The submarine dove before anyone could positively identify it. The Japanese commander, whoever he was, had learned something from RO-106's death. Stay deep. Make them guess. Raby fired 4 Hedgehog attacks starting at 0617, all misses. The submarine turned inside the patterns. George tried next. Miss. Again and again. Between 0730 and 0810, Hedgehog rounds splashed into the Pacific and sank in silence, leaving only frustration and the dawning fear that this commander might be better than the last. From the deck of George, Commander Haines watched the engagement drag and understood a brutal truth. The group had 3 ships, but only one had been finishing the job. Pendleton's England. It could be better sonar operators, faster loading, cleaner firing solutions, better discipline under pressure. Whatever the cause, the pattern was emerging like a statistical curve. When England attacked, submarines died. When the others attacked, the enemy lived long enough to keep teaching them new tricks. Haines radioed a phrase that would become legend in the escort forces. "Oh, hell. Go ahead, England." Pendleton accepted the handoff without ceremony. He didn't make a speech. He didn't celebrate. He simply ordered the ship into position. His first attack missed. The submarine turned. The crew didn't panic. They treated it like data. Second attack at 0834, 10 detonations, maybe 12. So close together they blurred into one continuous roar. Then the breaking up noises, the sound sailors learned to recognize without ever wanting to. Metal tearing, bulkheads collapsing, then a major underwater explosion minutes later, likely batteries rupturing, turning a sealed pressure hull into a boiling death trap. By 10:45, oil and debris surfaced. Kill number 3, 72 hours, 3 submarines. And now the rumor was spreading through the Pacific escort forces. There was a destroyer escort out there killing submarines like it was a target range. That kind of rumor does something dangerous. It builds confidence. And confidence tempts people to believe the ocean is finally on their side. The ocean never is. At 0120 on May 24th, George's radar detected RO-116 on the surface. Range 15,000 yards, the submarine dove at 0030. England established sonar contact at 0150, and now the pattern repeated. Radar detection, crash dive, sonar tracking, Hedgehog attack. But RO-116's commander tried something different. Instead of diving deep, 300, 400 feet, he stayed shallow, 150 feet. It was a clever bet. Most submarine commanders believed the danger was worst near the surface. They wanted maximum water above them as cushion. They wanted space to maneuver. Going shallow felt reckless. But shallow had an advantage. It reduced the descent time of the Hedgehog projectiles, meaning the attacker had less time to correct, less time to watch a submarine's turn, less time to refine the solution. If you could force the Americans to fire as if you were deep, they would overshoot. RO-116's commander bet Pendleton would assume he went deep. He bet wrong. Pendleton's sonar operator called out the shallow depth immediately, and Pendleton adjusted without hesitation. First attack at 02 on 4. 3 detonations, maybe 5. Not the massive cataclysm of earlier kills, but that didn't mean the submarine survived. It meant something worse. A breach without immediate destruction. A Hedgehog projectile didn't have to annihilate a submarine to kill everyone inside. It only had to punch holes in the pressure hull. At that depth, water enters with brutal force. Flooding isn't a leak. It's a violent invasion. A 3-inch hole becomes a fire hose of the sea, and the submarine's internal systems, pumps, valves, crew procedures, start losing the argument immediately. Breaking up noises came later, not as a thunderclap, but as a groan. RO 116 began to settle. More water meant more weight. More weight meant deeper. Deeper meant more pressure. More pressure meant faster flooding. The physics was merciless and self-reinforcing. By dawn, a small quantity of oil surfaced at 0702, then expanded into a slick that grew and grew as the hours passed. 56 more sailors gone. Kill number 4, 5 days, 4 submarines. And now the story had left the escort forces and reached the top of the Navy. Word found Admiral Ernest King in Washington, the Chief of Naval Operations, the man who commanded every ship in the United States Navy. He read the reports. 1 destroyer escort, 4 confirmed kills in 5 days, using a weapon most captains didn't trust. King was not known for sentimentality. His message was short, simple, and it spread like fuel through the fleet. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. Fame is a weapon of its own. It can harden a crew. It can make officers take risks to justify the reputation. And it can do something else. It can make higher command nervous. Because if England was truly that effective, then England was also truly valuable. And valuable assets don't get thrown into the grinder lightly. By May 25th, there were voices, powerful voices, arguing that England should be reassigned to carrier escort duty. 4 kills made her crew experienced. Experienced crews were rare. Protect the asset. Don't risk it in a mission that could be completed by others. But Commander Haines saw the numbers differently. 3 submarines remained on the NA line. RO 15, RO 108, RO 109. And England had already killed 4 in 5 days. The math suggested she could kill the remaining 3 if she was allowed to stay in the fight. Pull her now, and the mission stayed incomplete. Japanese submarines would keep reporting carrier movements. The intelligence advantage would weaken, and the Japanese would have time to adapt. Haines pushed for 1 more patrol. Higher command reluctantly agreed. And in the late hours of May 26th, the 5th submarine revealed itself. At 2303, Raby gained radar contact on RO 108 at 15,000 yards, roughly 100 nautical miles northeast of Seidler Harbor. The submarine Dove. England gained sonar contact at 1650 yards, and the Japanese commander repeated the shallow tactic, believing the escorts couldn't track him long enough to get a clean solution. But Pendleton's crew had already tracked 4 submarines to death. They knew the rhythm of evasion, the timing of turns, the subtle shifts in speed. Raby tried to move in for the kill and missed with Hedgehog. Haines didn't hesitate. Go ahead, England. At 23:23, England commenced the attack. The launchers fired. The projectiles splashed. 4 hits, maybe 6. The detonations were so tight they sounded like one continuous impact. RO 108 broke apart immediately. Not a slow sinking, not a long struggle. An implosion, 56 men dead in seconds. Kill number 5, 6 days, 5 submarines. And now, far away at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyoda reviewed patrol reports that didn't exist. 5 submarines missing. No distress calls, no emergency transmissions. Just silence. 1 submarine every day. Something was killing his boats. Something fast. Something accurate. And something his commanders couldn't evade with their usual tricks. Toyoda issued new orders to the remaining submarines on May 27th. Deeper patrol depth, 400 feet minimum. No battery recharging unless absolutely necessary. Run silent on first detection. Radical maneuvers made noise, and noise gave the enemy better data. The Japanese were learning, but they were learning from dead men's mistakes. And the NA line still had submarines left, the ocean still held targets, and England still had Hedgehog rounds in the magazine, though not enough to waste. Because the next kill would not be easy, not like the others. The next commander would play the mathematics game better, and Pendleton would have to prove that numbers weren't just a theory. They were a weapon. By May 27th, the Pacific had started to whisper a new kind of fear, one that didn't come from torpedoes or bombs, but from silence. At Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyoda reviewed the NA line reports and saw a pattern that didn't make sense. 7 submarines deployed, 5 missing. No distress calls, no emergency transmissions, no survivors to explain what happened. Just absence. A boat disappearing every 24 hours like a hand reaching down into the ocean and plucking steel out of it. Toyota's staff didn't have a name for the thing killing them. They didn't know about Hedgehog. They didn't understand the American advantage in code breaking. They only knew something was hunting the hunters and doing it with an accuracy that felt impossible. So Toyota did what smart commanders always do when they can't see the weapon. He tried to change the rules of the game. New orders went out to the remaining NA line submarines, RO-105 and RO-109, minimum patrol depth, 400 feet, no battery recharging unless absolutely necessary. Run silent at first detection, no radical maneuvers. Radical maneuvers made noise. Noise made sonar tracking easier. The Japanese were adapting. But they were adapting with a terrible handicap. They were learning from 5 dead crews who could no longer tell them what really worked. And out on the ocean, Commander Haines's hunter-killer group, England, George and Raby, kept sliding northeast along the invisible fence line like a blade. The NA line still had 2 submarines left, and USS England had a new problem. Ammunition. Hedgehog was brutally honest. It didn't let you feel good about a miss. But it also didn't let you pretend misses were cheap. Every attack fired 24 projectiles. Every try again was a hard subtraction from a magazine that couldn't be refilled in the middle of nowhere. Pendleton knew the inventory like a man counting matches during a winter storm. He had made 5 kills, with roughly a handful of attack runs each, and the numbers were shrinking fast. The crew could load quickly, yes. They could fire with discipline, yes. But metal was finite. The ocean wasn't. In anti-submarine warfare, that imbalance could kill you. Because a submarine commander didn't have to win forever. He only had to survive until you ran out of options. RO-109 was still somewhere out there, quiet, cautious, listening. RO-105 was the one who would test Pendleton's method harder than any of the others, not because RO-105 was stronger, not because she was faster, but because her commander understood something fundamental. Hedgehog was a mathematics weapon, and mathematics could be defeated by one thing, not courage, not tradition, not luck, but uncertainty. If you could make the sonar picture weak, intermittent, ambiguous, if you could force the attacker to fire into a maybe, you could waste his magazine without ever giving him a clean solution. That was Toyota's new doctrine. Go deep, go quiet, go invisible, make the Americans spend their certainty on shadows. On the night of May 30th, the Pacific looked the same as it always did. Dark, wide, indifferent. At 21:45, George detected a radar contact. RO-105. For a moment, it was a clean hunt, a submarine on the surface, batteries recharging, engines breathing air, a perfect chance to pounce. RO-105 crash-dived immediately. But this time, the Japanese commander didn't dive shallow and turn hard. He went deep, 400 feet. Then he did something far more dangerous than speed or maneuvering. He stopped everything. All engines, all propeller noise, all machinery vibration. Complete silence. To a sonar operator, a silent submarine at depth could become a ghost, an intermittent return, a weak echo that flickered like a dying light. England established contact at about 2,200 yards, but it was fragile. The kind of contact that could be real, or could be the ocean lying to you. Sonar crews had a name for that kind of deception. A knuckle, disturbed water, shifting layers, false returns. Pendleton faced an ugly choice. Fire Hedgehog into a weak contact and probably miss, wasting 24 projectiles he might never get back. Or wait, and give the enemy control of time. In war, control of time is power. If Pendleton waited, RO-105's commander could choose when to move, when to surface, when to sprint, when to become detectable again. Waiting could mean letting the prey decide the rules, but firing into uncertainty could mean bleeding the ship dry. Pendleton chose to wait. The CIC clock moved slowly. The sonar return stayed weak. The contact faded, returned, faded again. Minutes became an hour. An hour became 2. At some point, the crew stopped thinking about the record and started thinking about the simple terror of being trapped in a contest of patience with a submarine that could surface anywhere. 4 hours passed. RO-105 stayed silent. Pendleton's crew listened to the ocean breathe. Then, around 02:30 on May 31st, the sonar return strengthened. RO-105 was moving. Battery power was running out. The Japanese commander had the same problem every submarine commander had ever had. You could hide underwater, but you couldn't live there forever. Sooner or later, the diesel engines demanded air. Sooner or later, you had to surface. Sooner or later, you had to gamble. And RO-105's commander had one final gamble left. At 3:15 on May 31st, RO-105 surfaced, but not where England expected. During the 4 silent hours, the submarine had drifted with the current, sliding miles away from her last known position like a coin carried by a river. George's radar caught her at 13,000 yards. Wrong direction, wrong bearing, wrong grid square. The hunter-killer group had been searching the wrong patch of ocean. By the time England turned toward the new contact, RO-105 had already crash-dived again. But the submarine had bought something priceless: 90 seconds of battery charging, 90 seconds of diesel engine time, just enough to add a sliver of power back into depleted cells, enough to run. In anti-submarine warfare, 90 seconds could be the difference between a kill and a lost contact that never returns. Pendleton understood immediately what he was facing. This commander wasn't panicking. He wasn't repeating the shallow mistake. He was playing the only game that mattered now. Make the Americans fire blind, then escape while they were empty. At 0345, England re-established sonar contact. RO-105 was running deep and fast, about 6 knots, heading northeast away from the group. The submarine's commander had studied the previous losses and chosen the hardest profile for Hedgehog. Deep enough to increase projectile descent time, fast enough to change position significantly during that time, controlled enough to deny easy pattern recognition. This was no longer the clean chain of radar. Crash dive, quick sonar, 2 attack kill. This was a duel. Pendleton's fire control team calculated the problem in raw physics. Hedgehog projectiles sank at a steady rate, about 23 feet per second. At 400 feet depth, that meant roughly 17 seconds from splash to target depth. In those 17 seconds, a submarine moving at 6 knots could travel around 170 feet. And that wasn't counting turns. That wasn't counting speed changes. That wasn't counting the ocean itself. To kill RO-105, Pendleton didn't have to know where the submarine was. He had to know where it would be 17 seconds in the future. Predict wrong, and the circular pattern missed completely. Predict right, and 24 contact-fused projectiles would do something no depth charge could do: turn a pressure hull into a shredded container at depth. Pendleton ordered the first attack. The launchers fired. 24 splashes. Silence. Miss. By a lot. RO-105 had turned during descent. Pendleton tried again. Second attack at 0423. Splash. Sink. Silence. Another miss. Closer this time, but still wrong. Now the ammunition count became an enemy of its own. The crew did the math with grim clarity. 24 rounds per salvo, 2 salvos fired. 48 projectiles gone. Pendleton's magazine was no longer a comforting resource. It was a countdown. If they wasted too many attacks, the submarine could simply outlast them, and RO-105's commander knew it. He varied speed, 6 knots, then 4, then 6 again, trying to make the solution unstable. Speed changes were subtle, but they shifted the future position just enough to turn a good guess into a miss. On George, Commander Haines watched the duel and realized something that chilled him more than any torpedo. The previous submarines died quickly. This one was surviving. RO-105 wasn't just running, she was winning time. At 0047, England's sonar operator noticed something. A rhythm. Not in the sonar machine, but in the enemy's mind. RO-105 turned every 4 minutes. 30 degrees to port, then 30 degrees to starboard, back and forth. Back and forth. The Japanese commander believed he was being unpredictable. But humans aren't random. Under stress, people invent randomness that feels chaotic from inside their own head. But from the outside, it becomes a pattern. Pendleton didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even mention it like a triumph. He treated it like what it was. A flaw. A crack in the enemy's armor. He adjusted the firing solution and led the target, predicting not just position, but the next turn. Third attack at 0508. 24 projectiles splashed into the Pacific and sank into darkness. Then 4 detonations, maybe 5. Not the massive merged roar of earlier kills. A partial hit. A breach. But RO-105 kept moving. Flooding, but moving. That was the nightmare scenario for Pendleton's crew, a wounded submarine that still had just enough control to avoid the finishing blow. Inside RO-105, the commander would have been ordering emergency procedures, blow ballast tanks, try to surface, save the crew. In theory, a damaged submarine might still reach daylight. In theory, men might climb out into air. In theory, someone might survive to tell Tokyo what weapon had killed them. But Pendleton's method didn't care about theory. He had one more clean chance to end it before RO-105 escaped, or before England ran out of teeth. At 0532, Pendleton ordered the 4th attack. Hedgehog fired. Splash. Sink. Then 8 detonations. Tight, violent, final. The submarine broke apart. Whatever emergency blow had begun stopped instantly. Oil and debris appeared at 0615 after sunrise. Kill number 6. 12 days, 6 submarines, a single destroyer escort, a weapon most captains didn't trust. And the NA line, Japan's early warning fence, was effectively erased. If you want more stories like this, real operations where tactics and physics mattered more than legend, hit like right now. So YouTube knows this isn't just old history. And if you want the full series of forgotten killers from the war at sea, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happened next wasn't a victory lap. It was the price of being too effective. When Admiral Halsey received the report, the numbers didn't sound real. 6 submarines in 12 days. 1 ship. 1 patrol. And it wasn't a carrier. It wasn't a battleship. It wasn't the kind of vessel history books loved. It was an escort. Small, expendable, built for one brutal purpose. And it had just done something no one would believe if the action reports weren't backed by debris, oil slicks, and Japanese post-war confirmations. Halsey's response wasn't celebration. It was protection. New orders. Pull England from submarine hunting immediately. 6 kills was enough. The ship had proven Hedgehog beyond doubt. Now the Navy wanted the crew intact, because a crew like that was rarer than steel. The Pacific Fleet could build another destroyer Escort in months, but it couldn't manufacture experience on command. One submarine remained, RO-109, but RO-109 was never found. After Toyota's warning, after RO-108 vanished without a whisper, RO-109 abandoned her station and ran deep and silent toward Truk. She survived the war. She surrendered in August 1945. And months later, after the smoke and ash and surrender documents, her crew learned about the NA Line massacre. 6 sister submarines destroyed in 12 days by one ship, using a weapon they had never seen. That kind of knowledge doesn't feel like history when you're one of the few still alive to hear it. It feels like a ghost story you're lucky to have escaped. It's tempting to say England proved Hedgehog was better, but better is too soft a word. What England proved was something more uncomfortable for a navy built on tradition. Doctrine can be wrong. Not because admirals are foolish. Not because sailors lack courage. But because the ocean obeys physics, not preferences. Depth charges made you feel powerful. Thunder and foam and shock waves. But they also made you blind at the moment you needed sight. Hedgehog didn't feel powerful. It felt clinical. If it missed, it stayed silent. No drama, no comfort, just truth. And once Pendleton's crew learned to live inside that truth, once they learned to treat every miss as data instead of failure, the weapon became terrifyingly effective. Radar forced the dive. Sonar stayed locked. Hedgehog struck without blinding. Repeat. And because it was repeatable, it spread. Not as a myth, as a method. With the 6th kill, England didn't just end a patrol line. She created a problem, because once a weapon proves itself, everyone wants it. And once a crew proves itself, command starts moving that crew like a chess piece, protecting it, exploiting it, worrying about it. Fame brought attention. Attention brought orders, and orders would drag England away from the one job she had been designed to do best. The Navy had extracted the lesson. Now it wanted to preserve the teachers. And that's where Part 3 begins. What happens after the greatest submarine killing spree in naval history? When war doesn't reward what you did, it only asks what else you can do next. When the sun came up on May 31st, 1944, the ocean looked normal again. Blue-gray water, wind, light chop. The kind of horizon sailors could stare at for hours and forget that somewhere beneath it, steel coffins had just been crushed into debris. USS England had done something the U.S. Navy wasn't designed to believe in. Not because the Navy couldn't accept victory, but because the Navy, like every human institution, preferred explanations that felt familiar. And 6 submarines in 12 days didn't feel familiar. It felt like an error in the paperwork. It felt like exaggeration. It felt like a story sailors would tell in bars and officers would quietly correct. So the Navy did what it always does after something impossible happens. It turned it into procedure. It turned it into doctrine. It turned it into a lesson that could be taught without needing the same crew, the same commander, or the same miracle of timing. Because the truth was uncomfortable. England hadn't won because she was bigger. She hadn't won because she was faster. She hadn't won because she was lucky. She had won because her commander trusted a weapon that punished emotional thinking and rewarded mathematics. And once you admitted that, you had to admit something else. That tradition, sometimes, was the enemy. In the weeks after the NA Line massacre, action reports moved through the fleet like sacred documents. Pages of sonar bearings, range rates, depth estimates, attack timings, breaking up noises, oil slick dimensions, debris descriptions. Everything written in the dry language of officers trying not to sound like they'd witnessed something supernatural. But beneath the paperwork was a more human conversation. Sailors who'd grown up on depth charges didn't just trust them because they worked. They trusted them because depth charges felt like war. Depth charges shook your bones. You dropped them and the sea erupted behind you. You could point to the thunder and say, "That's what we did." Hedgehog didn't give you thunder unless you earned it. If you missed, it stayed silent. And silence feels like failure, even when it's just truth. That psychology mattered. Because anti-submarine warfare is the kind of combat that can turn a crew into gamblers. Ping, guess, charge, drop, hope. Hedgehog demanded a different mindset. Ping, track, predict, fire, confirm. And if there's no explosion, don't blame the ocean. Fix your math. That's what England had proven. Not merely that Hedgehog was effective, but that it required a crew willing to embrace a brutal idea. A miss is information, not shame. The fleet's analysts didn't need romance. They needed numbers, and the numbers were ugly for depth charges. British records from the war famously showed that thousands of depth charge attacks produced a comparatively small number of kills, while Hedgehog, though less widely used, produced far better ratios. Those statistics weren't the whole story, war never is, but they supported what Pendleton had demonstrated in real time. Depth charges often forced you to lose sonar contact during the attack. Hedgehog let you keep sonar contact and strike ahead of the ship. Hedgehog's contact fuses meant explosions were confirmation, not guesswork. And once that logic clicked, it spread fast. Not because officers suddenly became geniuses, but because a fleet at war is a learning machine, and England had handed it a blueprint. In fleet briefings, nobody called it the England method officially. The Navy doesn't like naming tactics after single ships. It makes the entire institution feel dependent on one crew's magic. So instead, the ideas were broken into clean, teachable fragments. Do not blind yourself during the strike. Treat sonar contact as the target. Protect it. Fire only when the solution is stable enough to justify the salvo. Watch the enemy's behavior for patterns. Humans repeat patterns. Use silence as feedback. Silent misses are data. If you wrote that on a chalkboard, it looked obvious. But it wasn't obvious to men whose instincts had been trained on the thunder of depth charges. It took a ship like England, a ship that made silence terrifying, to force that change. Here's the part that history books tend to skip. After the greatest submarine-killing spree in American naval history, USS England didn't become a celebrity ship with parades and speeches. She became what she had always been: an escort, a working ship, a tool. And tools get used until they break. Through the rest of 1944, England performed the kind of missions that rarely become legends: escorting convoys, protecting sea lanes, supporting base buildups in the Pacific. At one point, she even ran aground at Seidler Harbor at Manus, an unglamorous reminder that ships aren't defeated only by enemy fire. She escorted convoys to the newly invaded Leyte later that year. Then came 1945. Ulithi, Manus, the giant machinery of invasion rolling north toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And out there, the war changed shape. Submarines had been a hidden threat. Now the threat came from the sky. By spring 1945, the Okinawa campaign had become a grinder. Ships weren't just fighting submarines and shore batteries. They were fighting pilots who had turned themselves into guided missiles. USS England took up patrol and screening duties near the Karama-Reto area off Okinawa. On May 9th, 3 Japanese dive bombers attacked. England's anti-aircraft fire set the first plane aflame, but flames don't always stop momentum. The aircraft crashed into England on the starboard side below the bridge, and its bomb detonated after impact. Fire, smoke, flooding, damage in the ship's nerve center. And suddenly, the ship that had hunted submarines by mathematics was fighting a different kind of equation. How long can steel hold together while men try to save it? England survived, but at a cost. 37 men were killed or missing. 25 were wounded. She made it to Karama-Reto under tow. Not triumphant, not celebrated. Just alive. After temporary repairs, England eventually reached Philadelphia in mid-1945 for more permanent work and even a planned conversion, but the war ended and the Navy looked at the balance sheet of ships and steel. The damage was extensive. There were many ships of her type. So the decision was made. Not worth repairing. USS England, the ship that erased a patrol line and rewrote anti-submarine doctrine, was decommissioned on October 15, 1945, struck soon after, and sold for scrap on November 26, 1946. This is the most brutal truth in naval warfare. The ocean does not care what you did yesterday, and the Navy, at peace, cannot afford to care the way sailors do. A destroyer Escort was built to be replaceable, even when it wasn't. Walton B. Pendleton received the Navy Cross for the May 1944 actions while commanding England. He continued his career, left active duty in January 1947 with the rank of captain, and later died on December 9, 1972, buried at Arlington National Cemetery. If you ever want a clean Hollywood ending, you won't find it here. The real ending is quieter. A man does something historic. The fleet absorbs the lesson. The war moves on. The man ages. The world forgets the details. Only the numbers remain. The Navy did keep one promise, at least for a while. Decades later, the name returned on a different ship, USS England, DLG-22, later CG-22, a guided missile cruiser commissioned in the 1960s and serving until the early 1990s. And then the name disappeared from active service again, which is fitting in a way. Because escort ships have always lived in the margins of history. They don't get the posters, they don't get the movies, they get the work, they get the losses. They get the results. The technology changed after WWII. New sensors, new torpedoes, new ships, but the idea Pendleton proved didn't go away. If your weapon forces you to lose contact at the moment of attack, you're fighting blind. Hedgehog wasn't just a launcher. It was a philosophy. Keep contact, strike ahead. Let confirmation come from impact, not hope. Treat silence as data trust, repeatable method over tradition. That's why the story matters. Not because it's the greatest spree, but because it exposes the secret engine of war. The side that learns faster wins, and learning often looks like heresy until it becomes doctrine. If this story earned your attention, do me a favor. Hit like so YouTube shows it to people who think naval warfare is just battleships and big guns. Subscribe if you want more WWII stories where the real weapon isn't metal, it's method. Because the most dangerous men in war are the ones who can do the math under pressure. And I want you to comment where you're watching from: Vietnam, Texas, Germany, Australia, anywhere. Because this channel is building a community that refuses to let ships like USS England disappear into silence. They were built to be expendable, but they don't deserve to be forgotten.